Welcome to the virtual hands-on portion of our workshop. This video is designed to give you a brief overview of what we would do in the lab under normal circumstances. It has been taken in such a way that hopefully you can feel a little bit like you're in the lab yourselves. Okay, so let's begin. The very first step is going to be weighing out the reagents we need to carry out the digest. So we'll need urea, Aeroacetamide, and DTT. I figured you didn't want to sit there and watch me weigh reagents, so I've gone ahead and done that off camera. Here I'm showing you the already weighed urea in a falcon tube, Aeroacetamide wrapped in tinfoil, and DTT in an Eppendorf tube. Urea can sit at room temperature, but I'll place both the Aeroacetamide and DTT on ice until I'm ready to rehydrate them. I'll be using our human plasma PeptiQuant Plus kit for this demonstration. I'll briefly show you what I have in the kit to work with. The first thing you can see is that it comes with a USB stick where we'll be able to find data analysis templates and detailed analyte information, but we'll get to that during our Skyline tutorial sessions. Here I'm pulling out the heavy labeled standard mix, otherwise referred to as CIS mix. We also have the NAT or light peptide mixture, which is what we will use to create the standard curve. And finally, we have Preweight trypsin and Preweight BSA. I will place the trypsin on ice until I'm ready for it, and I will keep the NAT and CIS mixes in the freezer until day 2. But don't worry, day 2 for you is just a few minutes away. I'm going to grab my Preweight BSA, and the first thing I'm going to do is rehydrate it to a concentration of 10 milligrams per ml using PBS. We will be digesting this BSA solution along with our plasma samples. The resulting BSA digest can then be used as surrogate matrix for the standard curve and the QCs that we're going to prepare later on. Now, before starting the digest, what I've done off camera is rehydrate the urea using tris and water to make a 9 molar urea 300 millimolar tris solution. Then I use this solution to rehydrate the DTT. And then I use the same solution once again to further dilute the DTT. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding urea tris to a new Eppendorf tube. And then what I'll do next is add the concentrated DTT to this new Eppendorf tube so that my resulting solution will become 9 molar urea, 20 millimolar DTT in 300 millimolar tris. And that will be the solution that I will use to denature and reduce the samples. I'll be setting up the digest on a plate, but you can use microcentrifuge tubes as well if you so desire. The plates we use are from Oxygen and they hold 1.1 mils per well. I've placed a little diagram on the top left here to show the wells that I'm going to use for this digest. I'll be using 2 wells for our BSA solution, and I'll be using 1 well for our 1 plasma sample. Now, first thing I'll add to our plate will be our urea DTT solution into the necessary wells. In this case, we'll just be needing 3 wells, 1 for our plasma sample and 2 for the BSA solution. Once all of our wells have urea and DTT, we can start adding our samples. I'll add 10 microliters of the plasma sample to well A1, and then I'll add 10 microliters of the BSA solution to wells A11 and A12. Here I'm just lightly tapping the plate to bring down any liquid that might be on the side of the wells. And now I'm going to use these tinfoil adhesives to seal the plate well before our first incubation. I'll be using a thermal mixer to incubate the samples at 37 degrees for 30 minutes. Usually what I do is I turn on the thermal mixer beforehand and set it up to the right temperature. That way when I need it, it's already at 37 degrees. The 30-minute incubation at 37 degrees Celsius will allow the proteins in our samples to react with our urea and DTT and become denatured and reduced. Once the 30 minutes are over, we can give our samples a quick spin. And then rehydrate our aeroacetamide to a final concentration of 100 millimolar using LCMS grade water. All this while trying to protect our aeroacetamide from light as much as possible. Once our aeroacetamide is well dissolved, we can add it to all of the samples in our plate. What the aeroacetamide does is it reacts with the reduced cysteines and alkylates them so that disulfide bonds cannot reform downstream. So here I'm just adding the aeroacetamide to the 3 wells that we're using. And then what I'll do is I'll proceed to incubate it for another 30 minutes, but this time we'll do room temperature. Here I'm just using a cabinet to keep the samples in the dark. After those 30 minutes are over, we'll need to bring the concentration of urea down to below 1 molar. I'll use 100 millimolar tris to bring down the urea concentration in the 3 samples. We want to do that so that urea won't interfere with trypsin's activity. I usually keep trypsin chilled until right before adding it to our samples. We rehydrate trypsin again using 100 millimolar tris, and we try to keep it cold as much as possible. We don't want it to digest itself too much, and we try to avoid forming bubbles as well, since these could also lead to trypsin inactivation. Trypsin readily dissolves, so gentle mixing is generally sufficient to get it in solution. Now we're ready to add trypsin to all of our samples. I've just added it to the plasma sample, and now I'm going to add it to the BSA solution that we've put in A11 and A12. Now we're ready to incubate our samples with trypsin overnight at 37 degrees Celsius. I'll just place them in the thermal mixer and then set it up to go for 18 hours. All right, so on day 2, the first thing we're going to do is quench the digestion by acidifying samples using formic acid. I'll be using 2% formic acid, but you can use 2%, 5%. Some people use concentrated formic acid. The point is to bring the pH of your samples down. So here I'm just adding 2% formic acid to our samples. Next, I'm going to pull the BSA digest. We want the surrogate matrix background that we're going to use for the standard curve and the QCs to be as homogeneous as possible. So let's go ahead and collect those 2 BSA digests into a protein low bind Eppendorf tube. Now that we have our BSA digest pooled, we're going to keep it chilled for now. And we're also going to keep our plasma sample digest on ice while we prepare our standard curve dilutions. So let's go back and get the cis and nat mix stocks that have been waiting in the freezer. I'll first rehydrate each stock mix with 30% ACN, 0.1% formic acid. It's important to be very precise and pipette as accurately as possible, especially for the nat mix, which is the one we will be using to create the standard curve as well as the QCs. Now we're rehydrating the cis, which is going to be used as a normalizer for all the samples. So to prepare the standard curve, we're going to make a serial dilution using 30% ACN, 0.1% formic acid. We will make it so that standard A is the least concentrated and standard H will be the most concentrated. Our stock is actually standard H. And we'll do the same thing to prepare the QCs. What I did just now is I added the appropriate amount of solvent to all of my labeled low bind Eppendorf tubes. And then what this illustration is showing is the steps to make the serial dilution, where we're adding the appropriate amount from the stock solution into tube G, and then from tube G to F, F to E, and so forth. And then I'll do the same for the QCs. Note that for the QCs, we have a couple of intermediate dilutions. We won't need these when preparing the final QC samples. All right, so I will use another one of our oxygen plates to prepare the standards, QCs, and our plasma sample. The first thing I'll do is add BSA digest to all the wells that will become standards and QCs. So I'll add BSA digest to all of column 12, or standards A to H. We'll do the same for column 11 and also for well H10. Column 11 and well H10 will become our QCs, which are prepared in triplicate. Then we'll go ahead and add our plasma digest into well A1. Our next step will now be to add our cis mix as internal standard to all wells equally. So we'll add cis mix to well A1, all of column 12, all of column 11, and well H10. It is important to pipette accurately at this stage since this is our normalizing solution and we want all the wells to contain the same amount of cis mix. Now is the time to prepare our standard curve using the NAD level dilutions we made previously. We will pipette standard A into well A12, B into B12, C into C12, and so on and so forth. For the QCs, remember that we won't use the intermediate dilution, so I'll just put those aside. We'll add QCA to the first 3 wells of column 11, then QCB to the following 3, and finally QCC to the last 2, as well as well H10. As a final step, we will dilute all samples, standards, and QCs with 0.1% formic acid. In this case, I'm adding 540 microliters to each well. I'm showing the addition done individually, but you can also use a repeater or a multi-channel pipette for simplicity or to speed up the process when there are many samples. Same thing for all the previous steps that require the addition of one solution to many wells. Now we're ready for cleanup. We will be using a Waters HLB microelution plate and a plate manifold for this. You can see that the plates come in a nice and tight sealed container. Here I'm showing you the waste reservoir and the spacer. And on the left here, you can have a closer look at this sandwich arrangement. The first thing we're going to do is condition the necessary wells with 100% methanol. You can see on the manifold here how the HLB plate sits on a spacer and then on a waste reservoir that collects all the flow-throughs and washes. The manifold has an on-off switch in the middle, and the positive pressure can be adjusted with the knobs on the sides. Once the methanol is fully pushed through in every well, we can add 0.1% formic acid to equilibrate, and then we're ready to load all of our samples, standards, and QCs. Here I've finished pushing the 0.1% formic acid through, and I'm now ready to load the samples. I will follow the same plate arrangement we've been following so far, but this arrangement can be altered or modified to be conservative and use as many of the HLB plate wells as possible. You don't want to waste resin if it can be avoided. Something that might be worth mentioning is that some samples may take longer to go through, and the pressure may need to be adjusted. So it's a good idea to always check that all the liquid has actually gone through before you add anything else. You don't want to start adding your washes and have one of your wells spill into another. Once the sample is through, we will wash all the wells using LCM as water, and we will repeat this step for a total of 3 washes, which I've done off camera. Once all the washes are done, we're ready to elute. We use low bind Eppendorf 96 well plates to collect our eluates. Here I'm placing the HLB plate and its spacer right on top of the elution plate, and I will be using 70% ACN, 0.1% formic acid to elute. Anything from 50 to 70% organic should be sufficient to release the peptides bound to the resin. During elution, it is important to really start the manifold pressure ever so slightly and increase it little by little, as sometimes sharp increases in airflow can cause the eluates to spill over, and that would be a waste of your precious time, as you'd have to start over. Once all the eluates are through, I'll use another foil adhesive to cover our plate. I usually spin the plate down one last time. And then freeze and either lyophilize or speed back to dryness. Once our samples are dry, we can rehydrate everything with 0.1% formic acid. I usually just carefully peel off the tinfoil seal, but other people pierce through it to rehydrate, whatever works for you. Here I'm just rehydrating the standard curve, all the QCs, and our one plasma sample. Once we're done rehydrating everything, we can place the adhesive back on. Mix well. I usually use the vortexer and give it another quick spin before exchanging the seal for an oxygen self-sealing silicone mat. And now we're done. Now let's walk together to the instrument. We're going to be placing these samples onto our Agilent 6495. Here I'm just placing the samples in one of the drawers. I'm just making sure that it sits properly. And now it's ready to be injected with an appropriate method.